Hello and welcome to another episode of the Power Law Investor. Today is August 31st, 2025, a Sunday. And as I'm making this video, Bitcoin is trading at 109K and Ethereum is around 4,500K. And in today's video, we're going to do a deep dive into the PAI for Ethereum. That's the Power Amplitude Index. And we'll talk a little bit about what the current value is, what that means in a historical context, and how you can use that as a guide to figure out when is a good time to buy. Again, this is not financial advice, so do your own research, and this is for educational purposes only. So let's start off first by understanding where we are in the entire macro cycle by looking at the Bitcoin power law. Right? The Bitcoin power law is looking at the log of the days since Genesis on the x-axis and the log of price on the y-axis, and drawing this orange trend line through it, which has a really good fit with an R squared of 0.9562, which means that more than 95% of the variation in price is explained by this line. So if we believe that the future is going to be like the past, we can make some estimates on what the future price of Bitcoin is going to be like. And so when we click that into the linear plane, we can see that the projection for price with Bitcoin is 142K in a year's time. This is the equation over here, and we're a little bit above the trend right now. But we also see that there are oscillations around this trend line, right? So in the log plane, you can see that we have ups and downs, and there's some degree of regularity. We can see it a little more clearly when we move to the linear plane. But really, if you want to look at it, we look at what's called the residuals. And we see that basically about every 4 years, the price goes way above the trend line. And so what that's saying is basically every 4 years, the price is going up above the trend line. So if we look at this, 2014 to December 2017, so let's call it 2013 to 2017, 2021, and then the expectation is 2025. So by looking at it in this way, we can see that the price of Bitcoin is likely going to spike if we believe, again, if we believe the future is like the past. And in that case, we can expect the price of altcoins also to go up. And this macro framework is part of this two-level framework that allows us to think like, okay, is the PAI going to be effective at this point, right? Do I expect prices to keep on going up? Then if prices are going to keep on going up, what is going to be a good time for me to figure out when to buy? And that is really what the PAI for Ethereum is designed to find. So here's the PAI for Ethereum that I had talked about in my previous video briefly. The way the PAI works is that we have a metric all the way from 0 to 1, 0 being the best time to buy, 1 being the time to be very cautious, right? Again, it's not a perfect system, and the more history we give it, the better it learns. And all these values that you see are values that you would get if you went back to a time, if you went back in a time machine and calculated the PAI. It's only looking at the data from behind it, from previously in time, right? So it's not that I'm looking at these from today's perspective and saying, oh, this is what the value would have been if I had all the information that I have available to now. It only looks backwards at the information that it has. So if you were realistically in the moment, this is exactly the kind of information that you would be having. And I want to go through this and sort of see and show you that the PAI has done a pretty good job of identifying good buying opportunities. So around here, we can look at it in the log plane over here. You're down to 398. And again, it's not perfect, but we look around here again, it went to 212. And then again, all the way at 150, so it was giving these signals. And then it learned. The algorithm learns from the history. Every day it becomes more and more accurate and says, okay, this was a low price in the past, right? Based on this particular trend model that I've developed. What happens in the future? It understands and learns from the both highs and the lows. And so the more data you give it, the better it becomes. Now you can see how accurately it starts predicting the price around here in June 22, right? Let us turn this off and on so you can see how accurate the bottom was over here. And you can also see this is from the 0.1 to 0.2, but then you can see the 0 to the 0.0 to the 0.1. That's really calling the bottoms effectively. And as we move on, it gives us more and more information. And we can see that most recently, around April 2025, we got the signals between 0.1 and 0.2 right around here, all the way from about 2000, let's say, or maybe 1800, all the way to about 1400, right? And at that point, the PAI was telling us this is a good time to buy, right? It's saying like these are the lower values that we've seen in our history. And unfortunately, I didn't have the PAI developed at that point. If I did, it would have been incredible and I would have shared it with you guys. But that's just the way these things go. It takes time to develop. And looking at the history, I now understood how to develop this learning algorithm for this, right? And the way this is structured, to understand it, we can look at what's called the cumulative PAI zone distribution. That's basically saying it's easier to understand if you first look at it from this way. This is telling us, this graph over here is telling us how much time it spreads in each of these zones. So it spends about 18.1% of the time between 0.2 and 0.3. And at the bottom is the cumulative value. So it's saying here, it spends 16.5% at 0.2 and lower. So it's got the sum of this and this, which gives 16.5. Over here, it says it spends about 35% of the time below 0.3, right? And so for me, a good metric seems to be, well, at 0.2, I'm basically looking at what percent of the time it's going to spend below this, right? And it says if I buy below 0.2, then I'm basically buying the price that it only is there about 16.5% of the time and lower, right? And so if it's 16.5% of the time lower, it's 82 and 83.5% of the time above it, right? And those are the kind of odds that I like. I want to buy when it's lower. And so what we're looking for is these blue regions. That is where we find that we're going to have the best generational buying opportunities. And the lower it goes, the darker the blue, the better it is. So you can see you got the blue region over here, but the flip side of that is you don't always get them. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get them, because obviously in the dark blue, you've only got it for 4.8% of the time, so 5% of the time. So I hope that is clear that if you wait for the lowest prices, you might not get them. So you kind of want to find a balance of like, okay, what is a price that I think I would feel comfortable buying that will give me an idea what the upside is going to be and how much of that time I actually get there, right? And with this perspective, if I took a really simple experiment and I said, okay, and I started doing this in June 2024, which is when I started looking at altcoins. What if I started in June 2024 and I decided to only buy at 0.2 and lower? What sort of prices would I get? And how would I compare that to buying every day, right? And that's what this particular analysis shows, right? This analysis is showing all these dark green triangles is where we had 0.2 or lower with the PAI, similar to the graph that we saw earlier. Here it is on the log scale. And you can see that they're all clustered around these lower prices over here. And when you look at this, you'll see first that you only bought 7.9% of the time or 8% of the time versus the daily DCA in which you were buying every day, right? So the standard reframe is that, hey, if you buy every day, you're going to spread your risk and you're going to buy more when the price is low and buy less when the price is high, right? And now this is the next evolution in that. And DCA is a pretty good strategy, right? But this is the next evolution of that. It's saying we're not only going to DCA blindly, we're going to use smart DCA. We're going to use this algorithm to figure out when is a good time to buy. And you can see that it does a pretty good job of figuring out those bottoms, especially when you give it more history. And that allows us to have to buy when the price is much lower. Now, it's not going to call the bottom perfectly, right? Just like it's not going to call the tops perfectly, but it's a much better strategy than buying simply with DCA. And that's what this strategy is telling us. That's what this analysis is saying. This analysis is saying that if we started in June 2024 and bought only when the PAI was 0.2 or lower, we would have an average price of $1,700 for Ethereum. Today, Ethereum is at 4,400. If you decided to DCA, which is a good strategy, you would end up with an average price of $2,700, right? So it's sort of, there are three versions of the world over here. You can go ahead and say, I'm going to figure out what the bottom is and I'm going to buy that myself. If you can do that, fantastic. Please share that with the rest of us, because I would love to know how that would work. If you can predict in the future, or rather before knowing what happens, you know that this is going to be the bottom. Excellent. Let's go ahead and buy that. So please, that would be great. But if we can't do that, we can go ahead and daily DCA and say every day I'm putting in $100, right? And then what is going to be my average price at the end of this time, this time period from June 2024 to today. But then you can use the PAI, and if you use the PAI, you get an average price of $1,700, which is pretty good because you've only bought pretty close to the bottom, right? The algorithm has learned from all the different exposures that we've had, the past history that we've given it. It's learning every day, aha, this is a good place to buy. Oh, this is not such a good place to buy. And of course, it doesn't predict the future. We can't predict the future. No one I know can predict the future. But it does tell us, by looking at the past, especially if we give it a fair bit of history, when is a good time for us to buy. And if we follow that example, we end up with a value of about 1,700, the average buying price. What is also interesting over here is the buying frequency. We're only buying around 8% of the time, the 8% of lowest prices as identified by this particular algorithm. Now, this may not be the 8% of the lowest prices eventually, but it's the lowest prices that the algorithm thinks that we're going to see, right? And so you're only buying at 8% of the time versus buying all the time. And that, to me, is a really good way to go ahead and try and figure out how these things, how we can make better buying decisions, which is really what this channel is all about. So, this is why that this DCA, the signal over here is so important. When we get a value of 0.2 or lower, then we know it's a good opportunity to buy. Now, when we couple this with our macro cycle over here, we kind of know when the PAI is going to be effective, because prices generally shoot up every 4 years, right, for Bitcoin. And we know that the altcoin market tends to track Bitcoin maybe with a little bit of lag, but they're very closely tracked. So what does that tell us about today, right? Today, the PAI is 0.523, which puts it in the yellow zone over here, which means that there is a lot of downside risk, right? There's been a lot of lower prices. Almost 80% of 90% of the time it's spent below 0.6, right? Does that mean it's a bad time to buy? This is when it gets into a really interesting situation that is hard to identify quantitatively, because we know that in this part of the cycle, price is going to take off. And we just don't know whether we're going to have better buying opportunities or not, right? You guys have seen the numbers. We might get more bluer zones, or we might not. So for me, given that I already have exposure to the crypto market, this means that if I'm going to increase my exposure, I'm going to wait for better buying opportunities to come in. And this is what that table over here tells us, right? This table over here tells us that if I wanted to wait for a 0.2 number, I'm looking to buy just under $2,000. In my opinion, that's possible, but I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. That means a drop of more than, 50% from where we are right now. But maybe I would think 0.3 is a reasonable time for me to buy in this sort of accelerated phase that we have. Regardless, everyone is going to have to make their own decisions on what that looks like. But you can see this allows us to have a quantitative framework for figuring out, okay, when is it a good time for me to buy? What are the kind of odds I want in order to get the kind of returns that I'm looking for? What is the risk that I am willing to take? And everyone's going to have a slightly different risk profile. Sometimes it can be a widely different risk profile. So I wanted to leave you guys with this, that the PAI does a really good job of identifying bottoms and also quantifying what is the upside price action time that it might have / time that it might have versus the downside basically. And so by looking at this table, we can all make our decisions on, hey, what's a good time for me to get in? And you can make your own decisions going forward. So As we go forward, I will be developing these for different cryptos. It takes a fair bit of work. I did want to share these results about Ethereum because they were very exciting to me, because literally if I had developed this algorithm about 4 months ago, I would have been heavily buying around this time, right? Around this price, because it's gone below 0.2. And so I would be sitting on excellent profits at this time, right? With this quantitative tool that works quite effectively. And I wanted to share that with you guys. Please let me know what other cryptos that you would like me to look at, and whatever gets the most amount of attention in the comments and the messages, I will start taking a look at and considering that for developing a PAI for that. Also, please sign up at powerlawinvestor.com for access to the latest PAIs. That's where you'll find the most current information. And thank you so much for your time. So please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one. Ciao.